cost of nutrient pollution in the US is estimated at $2.2 billion per year. So huge economic costs of not adequately managing our nutrients. Now, the point I want to hit home here, as a water quality person who really focuses on understanding what the fate of and impact of those nutrients are once they hit our waterways, is that lakes respond to phosphorus in parts per billion levels. And parts per billion is a concept that's not intuitive. But what this means is if you add a couple drops of fertilizer to a tank truck of water, you get the potential to create an ecosystem as green as Lake Winnipeg. So it is really a very tiny proportion of the inputs that we put into land and we put into our sewage treatment plants that can lead to this type of ecological change. And this type of ecological change doesn't just matter for my daughter swimming in a lake that matters to me, but it also matters to our drinking water. So if you're drinking Regina's drinking water, and I suspect you all are, this is a lake that really, really struggles with high nutrient concentrations and dealing with algal blooms. And anyone who was in Regina this spring, when you couldn't plant your garden because you couldn't use water, knows this story all too well. Now, of course, you're at a meeting on agriculture. I'm talking to you about water. The link is pretty obvious. All farmers, and our farmers, I meant to say all farmers, are water managers. And this is obvious, right, in terms of controlling irrigation, controlling drainage, but even things like implementation of reduced tillage, which traps snow, which affects the hydrology of that field. So all of these decisions that we make tend to impact the hydrology and also impact the downstream ecosystems via those impacts on hydrology and what's coming off the fields. So we know that most arable production is based on natural precipitation. So that means that farmers, as water managers, as hydrologists, as water engineers, are really susceptible to changes in those natural precipitation patterns and really susceptible to year-to-year variation and climate change. We know that irrigation accounts for a massive proportion of the consumptive use of water. And this irrigation usage is becoming under more pressure as there's less and less water to go around. Both of these are also, of course, susceptible to climate change. We know that agriculture changes the way, changes the land in ways that affect the hydrology and impact the quality of water. And we know that nutrient pollution remains, despite our decades of work on the topic, the #1 threat to water quality, not just in Canada, but globally. It's a big problem. It's a big problem we haven't been able to solve yet. Now, to switch back to what you all like to think about, I think, on a global scale at least though, currently we have enough food production to feed all 7+ billion people on the planet. We know that more than 1 billion people are undernourished, so certainly we have evidence that feeding the world isn't just a farm problem, it relates to distribution of food. But if we want to fast forward to 2050, we know that to meet growing global populations and changes in diets, we're going to need 70% more food production. And some people say we're going to need double the food production. And 2050 is before my daughter will be 40. So this is not an unimaginable time period away. I should be retired by then, but we'll see. So we know we need more food, but this is overlaid on the fact that we also have an increased reliance on biofuels, and there's a growing interest in bioindustrial products. So fasten your seatbelts. We're going to have some interesting times in terms of the demands for agricultural production and how this relates back to water. Now, overlaid on all of this, of course, is climate change. And this map shows you what the projected impacts of climate change on food production are likely to be. So the areas of red are bad news, and the areas of green suggest increased crop production. Now you see much of Canada is actually colored green. So this creates interesting opportunities for Canada where we have a gap in terms of food production, and we see potential for Canada to help make up some of this food gap. Now, I think this is a good time to stop and talk again about the links between food and water. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization have this statement that there is no food security without water security. And this isn't news to any farmer, but this is not the way we have traditionally managed our resources. We really haven't integrated agriculture and water management to the extent that perhaps we need to. So achieving food security really requires us thinking about food resources and aquatic resources and hydrology together. Now, if we look to this map again and we see that area of green for Canada, we certainly see the potential for opportunities for Canada in helping meet this food gap. But before you get too comfortable in that assertion, I'm going to put up this map. And this map is a map of 21 global climate models. And these are the precipitation maps. So all this map says, if the figure is red, it says it's very likely that we're going to see a decrease in precipitation. If the color is blue, it suggests we're going to see an increase in precipitation. And if the area is white, it means the global climate models do not agree on what's going to happen in terms of precipitation. And the map on the top is the growing season. So that's one area that you might want to think about. Now, we know that temperatures, the models do a good job in predicting temperatures, and we're going to see an increase in temperatures. So if we don't see an increase in precipitation at the same time, we're going to be losing water because evaporation is going to go up. So we need to see that parallel increase in precipitation. But across most of Canada, we don't have agreement in the global climate models, so we don't know for sure what types of impacts to anticipate. So while some studies suggest that there's a lot of potential for Canada to increase food production and help meet this food gap, there's certainly some pretty significant inherent risks here. Now, this study is an opportunity to travel in time. This researcher here used tree cores to understand hydrology from long before we have instrumental records. And what you have on the vertical axis is what's called the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And all you need to know is the negative numbers are significant droughts, and the positive numbers reflect wetter phases. Now, see if I can drive this laser pointer. Okay. This drought here is the one that drove my grandparents out of the prairies. And it's certainly one that is invested in at least our nation's history. If we look further back in time, before the impacts of climate change, we see much longer significant droughts. So we know that, at least in the prairies, we have natural oscillations in wet and dry periods, and that the extent of drought, extent of natural drought, has been very significant in the past. We really haven't seen the likes of some of these natural droughts since we've built the society that we live in. And we anticipate, as a function of climate change and an increase in some of these extremes, that we'll be seeing more of these potential extreme droughts. Oops. Now, as we see this increase in demand for food, we're also going to see increasing competition for resources like water and land. And land certainly has become under a great deal of pressure from urban expansion, but water is also under a great deal of pressure. Now, we know, for example, that irrigation is absolutely key to Alberta's economy and to a lot of farmers' livelihoods. But we also know that in the South Saskatchewan River Basin in Alberta, there is no more water to allocate for irrigation. That river basin is fully allocated on the Alberta side. So certainly reasons to think about the future with a bit of concern. Now back to Lake Winnipeg. These are satellite images, so when you can see an environmental problem from space, it's typically not a good news story. And Lake Winnipeg was named recently as the most threatened lake in the world. Now, When we talk about nutrient pollution, here's my Limnology 101 in one slide. When we have a nice, clear lake, it's resilient in that state. It's got some internal feedbacks that want to keep it in that state. However, once you get to having a green lake, like Lake Winnipeg, it's really, really hard to push that lake back. So we need to work harder on prevention rather than coming in trying to solve problems once we know they exist. But we also need to be patient and proactive in terms of trying to bring some of these lakes back. Now, when we think about nutrient pollution and talk about nutrient pollution, we know that solutions aren't simple. The U.S. Academy or management of nutrients as one of the grand challenges for the 21st century. Now, one, I think, positive case study in talking about nutrient pollution is a case of Lake Simcoe. And this is a case where we've been perhaps a little bit ahead of the curve in addressing some of the nutrient pollution problems that we face. So for those who don't know Lake Simcoe and haven't been ice fishing on it, the picture on the bottom right suggests pretty heavy ice fishing presence on the lake. Now in the summer it's also got a lot of recreational use. It's a really important recreational water body, in part because it's in such a highly populated part of the country. But in the winter it is overrun by ice fishermen because it's a great spot for ice fishing. And that fishery is estimated to be worth about $160 million a year. That fishery is also considered to be at risk because what's happened is increased phosphorus inputs into the lake have led to increased algal growth. And as those algae die and settle at the bottom of the lake, they take up oxygen, the fish don't have the oxygen they need, and the fish can't reproduce. So we see this as the most significant, or one of the most significant impacts of nutrient pollution. Now, if we look at the estimated natural loads of phosphorus to Lake Simcoe, we see that they're about a third, a small fraction of what the loads were in the 1980s. Now, the good news is we got in there as we were learning about nutrients and how to better manage them, and we spent a lot of money on sewage treatment and managing urban effluent. And we saw that load reduction, a very significant decrease in loads. The problem with Lake Simcoe is it's really sensitive to nutrients, and this fishery is really sensitive to those nutrients. So current work suggests we've got to go a lot further in terms of reducing nutrient inputs to that lake. And we've reached, or nearly reached, the technological limits of decreasing those nutrient loads via wastewater and the economic limits, where it would cost hundreds of times more to improve sewage treatment to remove those nutrients than it would to look to our on-farm solutions to control some of the different nutrient sources. So what's being done has been a nice catchment by catchment approach, going to look at the different soils, the different farm practices, the different streams, and understanding what types of management practices in those individual catchments will work. So one example here is we see when we control livestock access to the streams, we have a massive impact on the phosphorus concentrations in those streams. This is intuitive, but certainly we can prioritize some of these management activities based on the specific characteristics of those catchments. So if we want to come back to Lake Winnipeg isn't going to be as easy a problem to solve, in part because we've been a little bit slow to get there. Another reason is because it's got an absolutely massive watershed. So if we have nutrients and need to think about controlling nutrients from across this watershed, this is a really large land area to think about managing, and think about the best ways of managing it based on, specific conditions in these areas. Now, there's a lot of factors that have contributed to the decline of Lake Winnipeg. And one part of the story is, I think, a really interesting part of the story, and that is the fact that a BMP, reduced tillage, has actually led to increases in phosphorus fluxes. And this comes back to the importance of really trying to understand some of the trade-offs in the decisions we make about the environment, but also understanding what the best management practices are for different conditions. So within areas where there's a lot of erosion, reduced tillage is great. It reduces particulate phosphorus movement. In areas where we see our nutrients moving in a soluble form, what we see with reduced tillage is that we get an increase in phosphorus near the surface, and that's really vulnerable to moving. So part of the story of Lake Winnipeg has been this rapid uptake of reduced tillage practices, and the fact that although there are other environmental benefits associated with reduced tillage, it can actually contribute to increased phosphorus fluxes. What does work? Well, you know, I can't stand here and prescribe appropriate practices across the watershed at that stage, but there's been some really nice work done by a group of landowners in South Tobacco Creek who installed a series of headwater dams, and those headwater dams have been working for more than 30 years. And what we see is they help reduce flood risk, which is a big issue in that area. They contribute to phosphorus retention, and they contribute to nitrogen retention. So this is one solution that can certainly be one piece of the puzzle here. Now, of course, when we talk about BMPs and nutrient management, and I see there's a breakout session on this afternoon, so to some extent I am preaching to the converted, but we have a huge number of different activities that can be looked at in terms of better managing nutrients. And of course, managing the amount of nutrient application is one key part of that puzzle. So in terms of implications of water for Canadian agriculture, just to summarize, we know that world food needs are increasing. We know that climate change impacts on world food production are expected to be very significant. We anticipate that this can create some major opportunities for Canada and create new business opportunities for Canadian farmers. However, while temperature changes and precipitation changes may be relatively benign, these impacts are uncertain, so we really need to be adaptive and build resilient solutions. And we also need to be ready for some of the extremes which are expected to increase. We know that irrigated agriculture in particular is facing increased competition from other water uses, so there's a real need for increased efficiency. And we know that intensification of agriculture is having important environmental impacts. And these impacts really do need to be addressed because we do need to think about food and water jointly. And in particular, we need to think about nutrient pollution as one of our grand challenges in water management and growing food. So to come back to this slide, you know, if there is magic on this planet, it's contained in water and best enjoyed with a good steak dinner. But we do see, you know, our water is incredibly valuable and incredibly vulnerable. So with that, thank you and take any questions.
Good morning. My name is Blake Benson. I'm from southwestern Ontario, about 10 miles from the shores of Lake Erie that has been inundated with algae blooms at times as well. Yeah. And this topic of algae blooms is what motivated me for my Nuffield Scholarship, a picture that I saw based on satellite imagery. Through water consumption around the world, and what resonated with me with my travels is that 50% of Canada's fresh fruits and vegetables comes from the state of California. And as we as Canadians enjoy those produces every day, like we had this morning, strawberries, out of season, pineapple, things that don't grow in Canada, obviously, we don't hear anything mentioned about reduction of consumption. And taking one look at me, you can tell that I can benefit from a reduction of consumption strategy myself. But that being said, as the aquifers that those states and provinces like Alberta become dependent on dry up and wither away, are we not at risk way before the year 2050 and the world becomes in need of feeding 9 billion people? Are we going to run out of water resources way before that event? And we don't hear about a reduction of consumption as much as we hear about the increased production. So can you talk about that strategy at all, possibly?
Yeah, so that's a great question, really interesting topic. Sort of hard to know where to start on that one. One of the reasons, so I talked about growing population and changes in diet. And our changes in diet, as the world becomes more affluent, have meant a real shift towards meat. And meat is very intensive in terms of water. If we look at how much water it takes as we move up the food chain, it takes a lot more water. And it also has a much bigger nutrient footprint. So if we're to think about reducing our usage, it's probably less about eclairs, and it's more about meat and thinking about meat consumption. And in terms of buying food out of season and so on, one of the things that global trade has done has really blinded us to some of these impacts, I think. And there's a concept that I think is really interesting, and it's called the concept of virtual water. And basically what it says is in every chair that we export, or in every unit of agricultural production that we export, embodied in that unit is water. And it's the water that went into manufacturing it or went into growing it. And when you look at maps of virtual water import and export, you see some really interesting imbalances. And you see particularly the prairies as exporting huge amounts of virtual water, which is really interesting when we think about the prairies as water scarce. And I didn't talk about, I didn't come back to that map and talk about the fact that, we think we're water rich, and parts of the country maybe, but parts of the country are really water vulnerable. So I think you've raised some really great points about some of the decisions we make around water, and particularly the drought in California. I teach a class, and I start each class talking about the news, and the drought in California just completely dominated the last time I taught the class, and I haven't taught it for over a year, but going back to it is really stunning in terms of how that drought has developed and how those impacts are really being seen. So great question, lots to talk about. Yeah.
Just one comment, Alberta and Saskatchewan do not rely on groundwater aquifers. There's a lot of misinformation when it comes to water, and just the assumption you built in is not accurate. We rely on rain-fed water. But my question to you is, what is consumptive use? Mm-hmm. Because you say agriculture is a consumptive use. Is it consumptive like using water to frack oil? What does that mean? And what does it mean to the water cycle?
Yeah, consumptive means we take the water and it doesn't go back. So things like thermal electricity generation, if you're using water to cool, you pull that water out of a river, but then you can put it back in. But a consumptive use means it's removed from the water cycle at that time, at that place. What does it mean? No, I mean, we can never remove water from the global water cycle. We're reallocating it.
There's just a comment and a question in regard to phosphorus. And as this gentleman said, we bring fruits and vegetables in from California. We are actually importing water.
Absolutely.
And we've had a controversy about exporting water. But in terms of grain production, and I'm a grain producer, is that we actually export a tremendous amount of phosphorus because phosphorus is lodged in the seed, and we return the nitrogen to the nitrogen cycle, but the phosphorus goes to China or to Russia or to India, wherever our customers are. So we're exporting phosphorus. And most of us, again, as managers and growers, we ration the phosphorus, and we ration it from an economic standpoint. So we tend, I think, not to, by and large, use too much phosphorus in our fertilizer program. The phosphorus also lodges in the soil and is not readily extracted from the soil. And I'm looking at changing a challenge into an opportunity here, and asking the question, is there any way that we can actually harvest the excess phosphorus from some of these lakes and that sort of thing? Because the end of phosphorus will mean the end of the world in terms of producing food. So this is a scarce, valuable resource. What are the possibilities for actually harvesting it?
Yeah, so great question, and it's nice to be here because you guys think about different things, but there's parallels in what we've seen and what we've read, certainly. So there has been some work saying global phosphorus reserves are declining, they're finite, and this should be a real reason for phosphorus conservation. Now, what I know from conversations with some other scientists is that just like estimating oil reserves is a little bit fraught with uncertainty, estimating phosphorus reserves is also fraught with uncertainty. And those numbers that we saw earlier are likely to be underestimates and that there's large reserves in Morocco. Now, I don't know. I'm not a geologist by any stretch of the imagination, but my take home from some of those conversations is that perhaps we don't have to worry quite as much about phosphorus availability from mining, but certainly your question about mining the phosphorus that's in our lakes causing problems is an interesting one and a good one. And there are some ways we can do that. People are talking about and thinking about whether we can grow biofuels and use biofuels as a way to pull some of that phosphorus out. What I've seen so far says maybe it might help in some circumstances, but I don't see it as a grand solution. So I think with all of these things, we need a bunch of solutions coming together to help really solve the problem, and it may be part of the puzzle, but it's not going to be a magic answer. Oh, sorry, I
blindsided you, so that's perfect. My name is Curtis, and I live in the south or near the south basin of Lake Winnipeg, and one of Manitoba's ideal ways to try and help rectify the phosphate problem is by restoring and utilizing wetlands. So I want to get your thoughts and opinions on wetlands, because I have a little bit of difficulty with it, because just restoring a wetland I don't think is going to be enough, because all they do is retain phosphates until we have a next flood event. Because we live in Manitoba, it floods every 5 years, and the phosphate will sit there. When the next flood event comes, it's going to flush it out. If you want to make and maintain new wetlands, let's make them so that they're usable and we're harvesting from them. Because I think harvested crops will actually move, and then we can export phosphate, like the question previous stated. But from a water scientist, I want to hear what your thoughts are on wetlands.
Yeah, and this comes back to what I said earlier about how it's hard to get a straight answer from a scientist. So wetlands are really important in the landscape because they reduce flood risk. So that's the number one thing. And there's been some work out of U of S saying some of the flood problems we're facing have been associated with drainage. And where we can keep water in the landscape and have it evaporate through the summer, we're going to have decreased downstream transport. Now, there are two ways that wetlands hold on to nutrients. One of them is by trapping the particulates. So the plants are sitting there, a bunch of turbid water comes in, lots of particulates, and the plants help that particulate matter settle out, and that particulate matter carries with it phosphorus. So they can be really helpful in that way, and that phosphorus may not move in the next flood event. However, some of the other forms of phosphorus can move. So wetlands, very much like reduced tillage, has different environmental benefits, even if phosphorus isn't one of them. Wetlands can have a benefit in terms of phosphorus and flood mitigation. Of course, they have a cost in terms of agricultural productivity. So are they a magic solution? No. Am I going to encourage anyone to drain their wetlands? No. We already have less than 50% of the wetlands we started with. So if we think about flood risk alone, that's a big problem. Best straight answer I could give you.
Norm Hall, farmer I was on the south shores of the Quill Lakes. Now I'm in them.
Yeah, I actually wanted to stop and take some pictures on my drive down. There's, wow.
You should fly over them.
Yeah.
Anyway, in agriculture, we have ILOs, intensive livestock operations, and they have manure management plans, and also there's no dumping of manure into water systems or so on. But we're in one of the largest ILOs here in Regina, and that water often goes into Wascana Creek, which goes downstream into the Capel system. And you hear others, Montreal just dumped into the St. Lawrence. That's happening all the time. And if an ILO did that, you can be sure that Ag Canada or Sask Ag and Food would be down their throats. But yet these dumpings of raw sewage into the water systems is permitted. And that's something we have to work on, because there's high loads of phosphate in that water.
Yeah, and I mean, Regina is spending, someone will know the number in the room, a lot of money on upgrading their wastewater treatment plant to try to address some of these issues. But if we look at the nutrient budgets for the system, and this might not be welcome news, an awful lot of the nutrients coming into the Capel are actually from agriculture. So So we need to address both, or we're not going to get anywhere. In terms of ILOs, I would say this is probably going to be the biggest area for increased regulation. And in the Midwest, there's been a lot of success in terms of developing farmer-friendly solutions like opportunities to compost manure and some subsidies on increasing the area across which it might be spread. But this is probably the biggest area where we can make gains in terms of nutrient management, because as mentioned earlier, where you have to buy the fertilizer to put phosphorus on the land, it costs you money. So farmers tend to be pretty pragmatic about that, hopefully doing some soil testing, choosing the right amounts. But where you have excess manure and need something to do with it, I think is where the best environmental decisions aren't necessarily being made. Yeah.
I guess I don't have that. No, here we go. Tom Jensen with the International Plant Nutrition Institute. And, there's always a challenge. We're all part of the whole picture. Mm-hmm. And farmers generally don't over-apply fertilizers, as was previously said. But there are losses mm-hmm. from agriculture. And farmers are trying generally to improve and to reduce those losses. We can't prevent them completely. No. And so, we use the 4R nutrient, the right rates at the right time and place and so forth. And it helps. But, I think we get too many fingers pointed at agriculture because we're an easy target. And, but I know, like for Lake Winnipeg and in Manitoba, they're working hard. All the municipalities, they're trying to get everybody to help out. And I think that's the key. It's all of us working together, not picking out one sector. And agriculture, we have to do our part, yes. Yeah. But it's hard for farmers to be able to afford big changes. And there's some contradictions in the system. Yeah,
I think a lot of the changes that might be helpful can be achieved with low cost. And I also think, when we're spending billions of dollars on sewage treatment, if we're not supporting farmers in reducing nutrients, then we're not actually spending our money very wisely. But one thing, and I do sense that I'm, preaching to the converted in terms of nutrient management, but there's a concept called critical source areas. And what it says basically is that in the majority of the landscape, if you think about a watershed, there's not a lot of nutrients coming off. But all it takes is one small area where there's a lot of erosion or intensive livestock operation that isn't managing its nutrients well or something like that. And that's where the problem is coming from. So unfortunately, it may end up being finger pointing to the one person who isn't managing nutrients well in the landscape. And our regulatory agencies, our management, our outreach isn't necessarily well designed for that. So that's something to think about and maybe provide advice on, because, as farmers in the landscape, you probably know where and what is going on. So we don't want to get to a finger pointing perspective, but is there a more constructive way to address some of those issues? Yeah.
Yes, hello. Now I won't be using my English French now. Part of a solution offer. Here on a farm, we were milking about 100 head of cows, and we have a cattail wetland. Mm-hmm. And I don't understand why either municipalities don't invest, or having governments, instead of spending billions, maybe $50,000 to set up a wetland. And there are solutions, and these cattails clean everything. City waters are not, the antibiotics are not removed from city waters. This removes it. And people are complaining, but there's solutions. Yeah. But I just want to offer that.
That's a great suggestion and a great solution. These treatment wetlands, and they're not that complicated to design and implement. They really can help in terms of managing waste issues like that. So that's a really great suggestion. Comment.
More? Yeah. Okay, sorry. My tongue's bleeding from biting my tongue here. I'm from Walkerton, Ontario.
Yes, I know Walkerton well.
And well number 5 is about 1.5 kilometers from our farm, and well number 7 is 900 feet from my office. Dr. David Biesenthal is a good friend and neighbor, and I think there's a really good news story in this in agriculture. I've deliberately and purposely had my my address removed from my name tag because I hate beginning every conversation across Canada with how I survived that. And the answer is beer, by the way. Nevertheless, but nevertheless, there's a real good news story in there for agriculture, and it comes back to a point that you made just earlier about oftentimes our issues in agriculture are really focused on agriculture and generally, and should be really focused on the root cause, and we need to stand up and be accountable and call out those people among us who are not being respectful of our environment. And if you read the O'Connor report, which is an extensive document, you'll find that Dr. Biesenthal and his farm was completely exonerated in that. And for some time, it sure did not look like that was the way it was going to turn out. So, we can be the focal point but we can also be the poster child and it's really purely a matter of the processes and procedures and the management. Isn't that interesting? Farm management on our farms. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on in terms of, being the poster child for good management. I think that's great. So thank you.